Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to another Sabbath service with After His Heart Ministries. Today, I have a question for you. Do you actually know what rest is? And the reason I ask this is because people have a way of twisting words. Let me give you an example. The word fulfillment. When you hear the actual words fulfillment, my question to you is what comes to mind first? Well, if you are a Christian, if you are a believer in Christ, you most likely are an American Protestant. Now, there are some exceptions to that truth, but the premise is simply this. That means complete, right? Finished, over with. Don't have to worry about it anymore, right? That's what fulfillment means. And we often like to lock in that information in such a way to say a prophecy was fulfilled. And I think it's really important that you realize that the word you're saying that itself has power. Okay. The best way I can put it to you is there's a reason why we call it spelling. There's a reason why we call the things that we call when it comes to words, when it comes to creating sentences, and all of the different nuances of grammar, the things we call them, the reason we call them what they call them is because it comes from the practice of power. Okay. Now, I'm going to get into this pretty deep later on, but we're not there right now. Right now, what we need to do is look at the fact that you will say with your mouth, fulfilled, and conclude that that is done, finished, over with, doesn't have to be touched anymore, etc. Right? So you can go eat your sodium nitrate infused pork fatback. All right. I'm sorry, pork belly. What's my point here? My point is that when we are dealing with words, we have to be very careful with those words. Fulfill is in the sense of filling a jar with water. And when it is to the top, it is full, which means it is filled, right? Fulfillment is the state in which that occurs, where it's being filled. Now, Yeshua says, not one jot or tittle will pass from Torah until all is fulfilled. But you don't even know what that all is. You don't understand that that's actually the commandments. And you don't understand that that's actually the Torah, and that there are actions and there are processes within Torah that are still mechanized. They are still in process. They're not completed yet. They say, oh, well, that's because there's a future for Israel. There's a future for the Jews in prophecy. I just had this guy say the other day when I was I was chatting with him. He's a Protestant Christian. He's a friend of mine, and I'll tell you how we became friends. The way in which we became friends was like this. I was at a ministry meeting, and I had talked to the cook who was preparing the meals and said, hey, look, what's for dinner? And they were like, well, it's pulled pork. It's applewood pulled pork sandwiches. And I was like, well, I can eat those. So since I'm paying for this meal, since I'm paying for this ministry event, can I get some sort of substitute? She says, oh yeah, sure. I'll make you some chicken. Great. So I have some nice, teriyaki chicken come out. And of course, then the guy steps up to the podium and says, for those of you who need a food alternative who can't eat pork, you have the chicken. Nobody else take the chicken. That's only for those who don't eat pork. Okay. So then I go and I get the chicken. I sit down at the table. I begin to eat the chicken. This other man comes and sits next to me, and he's got the pork sandwich. So this is what he tells me. He says, Jesus died, so you don't have to do that anymore. I said, sir, I will run circles around you in this subject. I will win, you will lose, and you will be very angry with me, and very confused about your faith. Or you can enjoy your pork sandwich, I'll enjoy my chicken, and we can be at peace with each other and be friends. He says, well, I'll just enjoy my pork sandwich then. I said, okay. And so we started talking about the things that were important to him, things that were important to me, that were not in conflict with each other, like golfing versus, the sign business that I was in. Well, anyways, the other day I ran into him and he was like, yeah, we just had this big old heated discussion about the book of Revelation. I said, God told me about 6 years ago not to study the book of Revelation. He goes, oh yeah, well, anyways. So he kind of blew it off. Like it wasn't really registering with him that if God tells a ministry leader not to study the book, that maybe he shouldn't study the book. He concludes that he should study the book because why? Because he has a Bible and because he was told by the pulpit it's okay to study the book. When the truth is, it's probably one of the most esoteric books. Well, I'd say John is probably the most esoteric book in the New Testament. But truth be told, is Revelation is just some straight up forbidden knowledge. And if you do not know what you're doing with that book, you're going to really, really mess up the whole process. You say, well, wait a minute now. People interpret that all the time. Well, you get my point, right? Okay. So anyways, we're sitting and he goes like this. He says, well, you know what? Those things were fulfilled, but there's yet still a fulfillment for the Jews. I said, brother, I said, I got to finish my coffee here and we can definitely talk later. I might be interested in even talking to you about this, but right now I'm going to work on my coffee. Which was my way of blowing him off because truth be told, he was not going to listen. He has cotton in his ears. Well, actually, no, he has like a tapeworm in his head from eating so much pork. But the premise is that basically what it comes down to in this whole entire scene is this. Fulfillment means fulfillment, not completion, not ending, not some state in which everything no longer is required, not in which you could actually be in a belief that it is satanic to practice the Torah if you're a Christian. I've heard that from people who are actually have a divinity doctorates diploma from seminary, saying that it is satanic to keep the Torah. Their Messiah kept the Torah. Peter, after Yeshua died and resurrected and went up to heaven, kept the Torah. Not so, Lord, for nothing unclean nor common has ever touched my mouth. Words are dangerous. But the word rest is probably one of the most misinterpreted words in the English language. So, for example, when you sleep, what is actually happening in your rest? Well, when you're asleep, a couple things happen. First of all, number one is there is a reduction in the amount of oxygen required for you to stay alive. There is a reduction in the amount of heartbeats needed. In other words, that the blood would circulate slower. But people don't know why. They don't actually know what's happening. They don't know the amount of activity that is required that you would have to drop into that state. You see, the moment that you start to fall asleep, all of a sudden your muscles start getting repaired. New tissue is being generated. Work is being done on a level you would not understand. Homeostasis is in process while you sleep. All of these mechanisms are operating to what? To recreate you. And here's the irony, is that within that whole trip, like I'm gonna do one of my classic things. I'm going to tell you the entire video in 2 sentences, and in those sentences, you could then turn off the video and not watch it anymore. Rest is all about activity. And that activity will always be a state of creation, which is going to be a shock to the system because it says that God rested, and we have interpreted that a certain way. Okay, so now it is very important in all of this process. Go ahead, turn off the video. For those of you who stayed, it is important in all this process to realize that what you believe rest is not what you think it is. And what you think activity is actually a state of rest and fatigue and the things that actually are creating the scenario by which you will need to step into a state of rest. So when we talk about homeostasis, what are we talking about? Well, interestingly enough, in a lot of situations, most situations, there is a hormone and then there's a counter hormone to that hormone. Now, there's a number of ways in which this occurs. This can occur through reuptake, and this can occur through actual chemical counterbalance, okay? And so in reuptake, there's a hormone release that tells the system to pull the hormone out of the neuroreceptors. And then in the counterbalance, there's actually a chemical process that occurs by which two things interact with each other and create a very different scenario than what they are when they're separate from each other. For example, testosterone actually counterbalances oxytocin. Testosterone is a masculine style chemical. It is what is behind aggression. It is what is behind assertion. It is what is behind the physical ability to defend, attack, whatever. It is completely void of empathy. Okay? Now, what's interesting is oxytocin is actually not void of empathy, but is infused with empathy. When you experience empathy, it's because of oxytocin, okay? There's no other chemical that creates empathy except oxytocin. Some of you might say, oh, well, wait a minute, doesn't estrogen do that? No, estrogen enhances oxytocin, which is interesting because testosterone suppresses it. Why? Because you don't want to go into battle and be like, oh, dude, I'm so sorry. I did not mean to actually shoot you in the face with a bazooka. My bad. You'd be like, yeah, that's exactly what you deserved, right? That's the premise, right? We're going to defend our land. We're going to shoot you, kill you, right? You're going to be unalived, and that's that. I don't need oxytocin going, man, I feel so bad about shooting that guy, right? Because I need to be able to defend my land. I need to be able to defend my herd, defend my people, right? Defend myself. Right? And so when testosterone kicks in, oxytocin is voided, right? But what's interesting is when a testosterone infused body gets near an estrogen infused body, it can't suppress the oxytocin. And interestingly enough, the estrogen enhances the oxytocin in the man. Meaning what? The estrogen actually causes the man to have more empathy. So the closer he is to estrogen, the less his testosterone has a say in the thing, right? And the more that he's disconnected from the estrogen, the more he is going to be disconnected from the empathy, from the process, right? Okay. So now you could leave the family, you can go hunt and gather and go to war, and you don't feel sorry for the enemy who was going to try to destroy your clan in the first place. Now we can focus on the other side. We say, well, the oxytocin present in the female makes her more bold. It actually gives her the ability to defend the nest. It gives her the ability to defend her testosterone-infused body when she is near it. So what's interesting is on the one side, when the testosterone-infused body is present next to the estrogen-infused body, it becomes more empathetic. right? It's more bonded, it's more loving, right? Well, then on the other side, the estrogen comes along and makes this one bold to defend her testosterone infused body, to step in front of the bullet, right? Whereas the estrogen causes her to nest and isolate and stay with the clan. The oxytocin present in her, along with the testosterone present, causes her to become bold, and it causes her to become assertive and willing to strike out and move forward, right? Okay, so you could see now where this this homeostasis process is occurring. Now it's interesting because when we look at nature, we will find something amazing actually going on. We will find balances occurring. For example, if there is some sort of introduction of a species that is not actually part of an ecosystem into that ecosystem, it does not understand the symbiotic balance of the ecosystem. In fact, the word eco itself leans towards a lateral connection between all. Okay. So now when that species is introduced into that ecosystem, guess what happens? Invasion. It will always become an invasive species. Well, guess what? In that invasive species, there will always be a predator that comes along and can take that invasive species out. I will give you an example. Here in Grand Junction, we have, for whatever reason, most likely somewhere along the lines, it was introduced either on a ship or on some other, thing where they wanted those kind of trees because they grow fast, they grow big, they're great shade trees, right? But they are an invasive species, is the Asian elm. Okay, the Asian elm is completely invasive to our environment here in Grand Junction. And when I say completely invasive, it has these little tiny helicopter seeds. Well, they're not actually helicopter seeds, but they're seeds that can be caught on the slightest breeze and carried miles. Okay. And what's interesting is there's thousands of seeds that are released when the trees go to seed. What's also interesting is that when it takes root, the root goes down deep, 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 deep. I mean, I have dug more than I don't know, I've dug more than probably 4 or 5 feet down into the ground and still didn't arrive at the end of the root. Because truth be told is unless you do that, you can't really unseat one of those trees early on because they'll break off and that root will sit under the ground until the next season and come up again. And when you're trying to maintain a garden or a xeriscape or something like that and an elm pops up, you got to take it right away. If you don't, then it will propagate very quickly. And I can tell you, when it's about that thick, you will not be able to pull it out of the ground. And not only that, but you have to do some sort of bad thing to it to stop it from doing. I mean, I have seen elms get cut off right at the trunk and bloom into these bushes that are becoming trees again. Well, enter the elm seed bug. The elm seed bug is actually the predator of the elm. And so the elm seed bug comes along, and what does it do? It actually puts its larva into the tree, and after its larva hatches, it goes and it eats the elm seeds. Well, here's something really interesting. There's a number of things that happen. First and foremost is the elm begins to release sap and covers these larvae. And so they end up dying, right? And so what happens is the elm seed bug actually realizes that it needs to adapt to that process and actually learns how to move its eggs and its females and its stuff off of the tree onto some other object until it can go back and put its larva in and it will attack the seeds again. So therefore, the whole entire system of the elm seed bug is now relocated off of the tree because of the sap. Well, the sap gets on your car, it doesn't wash off. The sap gets on things and it actually can cause oxidation and it can cause a number of other damages. So anytime you have an elm tree and it's actually raining down that sap on your stuff, it is ruining your stuff because it's very acidic. Okay, now in all of that process, the elm seed bug is the answer to the invasion. However, the elm seed bug itself is an infestation because they figured out they need to propagate a bunch in order to effectively attack one of these trees. So now what? The elm seed bug becomes the infestation and the problem. They climb up high and then they drop down into the canopy to find the female, and the female's releasing a pheromone very similar to human pheromones. And so as a result of that, they think you're a female, they'll drop right down onto your face, right down into your mouth while you're sleeping, right down into your food. We've had little cups in our chandelier that are the diffuser for the light fill up that much with elm seed bugs. And these little elm seed bugs are probably the size of a grain of rice. Now, why do I bring this up? Because that's an ecosystem that has an invasive species in it, but we see balance being brought to the system. The invasive species was not allowed to continue without a predator. And now there is what? A necessity for another predator because the elm seed bugs have become an infestation. So another predator is coming and they will propagate and they will end up becoming the pest, and the elm seed bugs will be gone because these elms are dying. Now, unfortunately, what's happening with the elms is that they are these huge towering trees, and these elm seed bugs get in there and start attacking the system of the tree. The tree begins to die, the branch becomes weak, and now you have a broken roof. And so you could see how this whole process of trying to balance things out is actually all this chaos. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I want you to understand nature itself is trying to balance itself. Hydrostatic equilibrium within itself is proof of that. In fact, the whole premise behind why we have earthquakes and volcanoes and all that is actually hydrostatic equilibrium. The other plate does not want to be under the other plate. And so it's creating friction. And that friction is actually pushing against it in such a way that it's actually creating hot spots, which creates volcanoes. Subduction zones are causing the volcanoes and eventually are causing the earthquakes. That's why we have tsunamis and we have the Ring of Fire in the Pacific, is because we have this huge subduction zone where plates are passing under other plates, huge chunks of continent passing under each other. Because hydrostatic equilibrium is yet again balance. Okay, so what can we learn from that? We can learn that there's actually going to be a balance when it comes to anything that is a natural process. When we have natural ordered processes, which are basically ones that repeat themselves in a cyclical manner, then we have something else actually involved in the process, and that is that we will have an ebb and flow of things. This is the concept of a biorhythm. This is the concept of a circadian rhythm. A circadian rhythm is what? Well, generally it's controlled by a number of things, but generally speaking, this is how it works. Early in the morning, when you wake up, you are given a number of chemicals to activate your day, okay? As the day starts to move towards the time when you are supposed to rest, during that time, there are other chemicals given to you to kind of start to mellow out those processes. By the time you arrive at evening, when the sun goes down and there's not supposed to be any light present, there is an infusion of a melatonin bolus, which basically is a releasing of that hormone, which makes us sleepy and tired. Now, there's other paralyzing chemicals that are involved in stopping your body from moving because it needs to do something while you're asleep. But let me tell you what it's not doing. It's not settling. It's not settling. In fact, there is more chaotic balance of ecosystems going on in your body while you sleep than while you're awake. In fact, muscle fatigue is an example of true rest. When your muscle just can't do it anymore, that's actually when your body's at rest. But what's interesting is when we actually rest, when we sleep, technically speaking, our body is in a huge state of operation during that time. Now, the reason why this is important is because when we start to get into the thought process of rest, we really need to tweak our brain. And I am going to explain to you more about that because in the end, what we're going to find is that there's actually biorhythmic stuff built into rest that when you grasp it, you'll realize that it's actually an extraordinary amount of activity. Remember, this series itself is about reality. What is the reality? Not what you think, not what you perceive, not what you feel, okay? But what's actually present, factually actually present. What I mean by that is that basically what we have is we have a number of things. The first thing we have is that we have a setup in which our body is designed to go through a 24-hour process. But then we also have a setup in which all of creation, including our body, is designed to go through a 7-day process. You know, it's interesting. Beyond Jewish folklore, and when I say Jewish folklore, what does it mean is if I was a reductionist, a deconstructionist, an atheist, and all of the above, that kind of means not Christian, but caught up just in factual evidence, we would call the Bible Jewish folklore. So beyond Jewish folklore, right, which claims that the Sabbath falls on a certain day because that's the day they claim that their ancestors claimed, that their ancestors claimed, that their ancestors claimed, that that's the day that manna fell double portion. And then the next day there was no manna, which meant that that was what? The Sabbath, okay? But beyond that, there's no evidence of a 7-day week. Even if we try to spin it, like some of the Messianics do, into a 28-day month in which 28 divided by 4 is 7, still, there's no proof of a week at all beyond what? Jewish folklore. So then we're going to ask the question, we're going to ask that question, that anti-Semitic, well, let me say anti-Semitic question, which is why does Christianity decide that there's a 7-day week? If they really don't want to be like the Jews, why is there still only a 7-day week? Well, some people say, oh, it was Babylon. Babylon taught them the 7-day week. Oh, it was Rome. Rome is the one who actually came up with a week. So when we say that the creation was made in 7 days, not 8, 7, not 6, 7, then we identify or we accept the concept that the week was actually established long before Rome came along, long before Babylon came along, and truth be told, the week itself is contained in that 7-day creation in which it is claimed that God ceased from his works. Okay? So now, there's a couple things that we need to do. The first thing that we need to do is we need to ask, okay, what is the word 7 itself? Can we go and we can find information about it? Yes, we can. Second is what is the word rest, right? And what is the word cease that we find? So first of all, let's go look at it in the completely bastardized Germanic language of English that has taken things from Latin, French, Hebrew, and German and made this language that has no logical grammatical function beyond that we just accept that it is real, and very possibly is probably one of the most distorted languages that you could possibly speak. But here I am speaking it because you can't understand some other language that I could speak. So from that point of view, let's jump over into that verse. It's going to go to Genesis chapter 2. And we'll just go ahead and start in verse Genesis chapter 2, and we'll be starting in verse 2. On the seventh day, God finished his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. Now, I'm going to go ahead. That's the Hebrew names version, which consequently I think they could have done better with that. But anyways, let's go down into the Young's literal translation, which is going to be quite literally what it says in the Hebrew. Well, to the extent that it can be comprehensive in English. And God completeth by the seventh day his work which he hath made, and ceaseth by the seventh day from all his work which he hath made. Well, that probably doesn't really do us any good either, right? It does not necessarily explain beyond the English what it's actually saying there. Okay, so then the next thing that we need to do then is we need to start to examine this. So the first thing I'm going to do, we're going to go into the actual Hebrew here for a moment. And in fact, what I want to do is I want this to be bigger Hebrew for my sake, actually. So yeah, in verse 2, so it says, Vayachal Elohim Bayom Hashvi'i Me Lakato Asher Asa Veshavat, well, Shavot, I'm sorry, Va Yishvot, there we go, Bayom Hashvi'i Michal Melachoto Asher Asa. That is this right here, just so you know, that's all of what I read right there. Now, what I can tell you is that when I read that in the Hebrew, I do not see the English matching it very well. But let's just say that we go ahead and we start to kind of break this down a little, okay? So let's start at the beginning. Let's work through this. Okay, so first and foremost, we have this vayachal, which is kala, okay? So the root word, it's to accomplish, cease, consume, determine, end, fail, finish, be complete, be accomplished, be ended, be at the end, be finished. Dear God in heaven, have you seen so many definitions for a concrete language in which one word is one word? There's a few reasons for this, and one of them is absolutely translational bias, where one of the singular most important rules I learned in Hebrew grammar at the very, very, very beginning. And when I say this, I'm not talking about Hebrew grammar learning from a rabbi. This is straight up Zondervan, like basics of biblical Hebrew. When a word is used the first time, it is the meaning of the word for every context. Now, we call that the law of first usage, and it is something that is absolutely foreign to cemetery school, where you have a student sitting at a desk in a lecture about Hebrew. What do they say? They say, well, in Hebrew, things actually mean a bunch of things. But in Greek, you can trust that the thing means something word for word. And yet, when I have the word ahav in Hebrew, it means love. That is the translation of the word from Hebrew to English, love. Okay? And yet, when I have the word love in English in the New Testament, I can't trust that it is always the word love. I can go through a list of grammatical changes to just the word itself, just from the idea of why it's being translated as love. We've got agape, philo, eros, pragma, etc., all meaning love. Ahav is one single word, and yet what does James Strong's do? He says, Well, it could mean this and this and this and this and this because that's what the King James translated it as because we went and we or because they went and they decided the context of the meaning of the word. Okay, let me make something clear. This is actually going to be a little bit harsh. If you are an American Protestant Christian who has no known origin of Jewish blood, then you probably call yourself a Gentile Christian and are proud of that fact because there was a Gentile inclusion into a Jewish covenant in which you get to be blessed and go eat your sodium nitrate infused pork belly and not have to worry about the consequences that these people have been scolded for in their behavior by God. Okay? That group who's that way now are expecting the truth that a word that means something in the Hebrew is actually translated correctly in the English. They have that trust of the translators. When the translators themselves are going, oh, you have no idea how hard that was to do. And what's crazy is the translators are actually translating it based upon what they believe about the doctrine in that space of scripture. Everybody does that, even myself. I unfortunately superimpose my filters of bias upon my translation of Hebrew. Now, I've tried to get better at that. I've tried to be more objective, and you guys know, for your sakes, I am extremely objective. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Okay. So now, here's the part that's important. Let's go back to this. To accomplish, to cease. What? To accomplish or cease, consume, determine, end, fail, finish, be complete. Okay, somewhere along the lines, none of this even really jives with the idea of stopping. Let me prove it to you. Okay. So we'll go, first of all, let's go down to the Strong's Concordance definition, okay? So this is basically where James Strong, after he concorded everything, did his best to try to give a dictionary definition, not a lexical definition, but a dictionary definition of the Hebrew word. So what does he say first? A primitive root to end. Okay, we're going to run into a problem there in a minute, but let's just say that we accept that. Whether intransitive to cease, be finished, to perish, or transitive to complete, prepare, or consume. Accomplish, cease, consume away, determine, destroy utterly, be, when or were done, be an end of, expire, cause to fail. But what's it saying? It's saying that the primitive root means to cease. Okay, so let's start there. Let's work through that thought process, okay? So we're going to jump over to the board here, and we're going to document a little bit of this stuff, okay? All right, so first of all, I have a cough, right? And then I have a lamed, and then I have a hay. Okay, so now what needs to happen here? First of all, we need to figure out, is this a child root or is this an adopted root? Well, for those of you who are in the congregation long enough to know that this is actually a child root, we'll immediately know we can just come along and we can just cross out the hay, right? Because this is a child root. Let me explain. So, adopted root is basically a word system in which there is actually going to be a parent root that has some sort of augmentation with a consonant that is going to be not a yod, not a hey, not a vav. And you know, if I just add one more, hey, we've got the name of God here. So here's a shocker. It's almost as if the adopted roots don't actually have the name of God in them. Not an aleph, which consequently is the lead ox or the supreme power, right? Or a doubled last letter, which is a strengthening of that which is upon the earth versus that which is in heaven. These are that which is in heaven. So an offspring that is actually bloodline child, okay, is going to contain pieces from the name of God, the beginning of the word Elohim, or is strengthened on the premise of a doubling. Okay? Now, there's special grammatical treatments for a doubling last letter, which we can get into sometime. But best I can explain to you is that you drop the yod, the hey, the vav, the aleph, or the doubled last letter, and you get the parent root. That's the beauty of child roots. Now, if you do not have a yod, a hey, a vav, an aleph, or a doubled last letter, guess what? It's really hard to determine the parent root. You have to go back and actually study the context of a parent root. Okay? Now, what's important about that is that now what we have is we have a let me do that in different colors so that we can continue to have some consistency. And of course, that redundancy of color actually teaches you better. So we have this open palm, right? That's a hand or an open palm. And then we have what? We have a shepherd's crook, right? That is basically what the drawing on the ancient pottery that predates even the flood in some cases is what you have right here. So what we need to find out is, does this ever in any circumstance mean end, and why would it mean end? Okay, that's going to be important. That's going to be a very, very important question that we're going to ask. So in order to really find that out, we're going to have to jump back over to our text. We're going to just go ahead and I'm going to copy this Strong's Concordance number, and I'm going to bring this over into what's called the Ancient Hebrew Lexicon of the Bible, which consequently was written by Jeff Benner, and it is part of his ministry of the Ancient Hebrew Research Institute. Okay, so a couple things that are really important here, or Ancient Hebrew Research Center. Anyways, a couple things that are really important here. First of all is that when we come into this dictionary, if in the digital version anyways, obviously in the paper version, you go to the back and you find the Strong's Concordance number, but in this one, when we go look up the number, we are going to encounter the exact pictographic and nomadic definition of the word, okay? So in this case, it is going to be kalla, kalla. And kalla is to finish, to bring to end, terminate, to complete an action event. But let's go back to the actual parent root. The way we do that is we just go back in our lexicon until we find PR. And there we are. Now notice that it says vessel. It also says whole, and it also says complete. Now watch this. The pictograph kaf. Let's go back for a second. The pictograph kaf is actually going to be this one here, okay? The pictograph kaf is a picture of the bent palm representing bending or subduing of the will, okay? And then what? The pictograph lamed is a picture of a shepherd's staff or yoke. Combine these mean tame for the yoke. An animal or land that is tamed has been worked and is complete and ready for use. Taming includes construction of holding pens, putting the soil to the plow, harvesting of crops, milk, or meat. One eats once the harvest is complete. Okay. So now, let's ask the logical question. Is that a proper translation to say what it says in the English? Let's go see what that is. I'll do a side by side. I will do the NLT on one side and the Hebrew on the other. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation. So he rested from all of his work. Okay? So we got the NLT on the one side, we've got the Hebrew on the other side, which I said veyachal, right? Right here. This is that word kala. All right. This is, you just have to parse it, which consequently you could do the moment that you go into the actual interlinear. You can click on that and it will parse it for you. So what's the Vav in this case? It is a conjunctive letter that switches time. Oh yeah, here's one that'll blow your mind. You want to speak Hebrew, you state the thing in the past and put an and in front of it, and it becomes exactly what you're doing at that moment. If you state something in the future and put the and in front of it, it actually says that you've already completed it. That's a fun one. But here's the premise behind it. The idea is that when it says, and he will complete, means he completed it. Now, there's a great mystery behind that built into the grammar itself. But the premise is that what we need to do is go back to the actual lexical root, which I'll explain in a moment. Okay, so in this case, yakol is actually the root kala. Jumping over to it, it says to cease, right? But the word kaf lamed itself means to tame. Okay? And so short version is that if we could really understand what that concept means in terms of Hebrew understanding, then we would understand it's not to cease or complete. Okay? Now, I will tell you how it is, but only after you understand what it actually means. Okay? So here's the concept. The reason why we call it tame for the yoke is because we lay a stick across two oxen, tie it to their necks so that they are unable to separate from each other. Okay? They're not allowed to move away from each other. If one moves, the other moves back and forth. Okay? Now, the premise is that there's always one who already knows to go the line. So this is how it works. A farmer will attach the harness to himself so that the plow is actually connected to him, and then he is connected to the ox. He will goad the ox to get it to start moving and then run with the plow and control it in such a way that it's actually going to turn the ox to keep it straight. Okay? And those reins are connected in such a way so that when he pulls on the rein, the plow is turning and therefore there's a straight line. Well, that training, that taming, is actually going to now adapt over to the next ox. So when he actually has a team and he pulls the plow after he has tamed that ox becomes the lead ox because he now what? Knows the path. Whereas the ox that does not know the path is yoked with that ox for two reasons. Number one, it's usually a younger ox and therefore has more strength. And the second is that the two together will pull the plow a lot stronger and a lot faster, but the one will always walk the line. The one will always lead the other ox. Okay? Now, if it's a team of more than two, the yoking ends up being one in which they still have a lead ox. They will never put two lead oxes together. They will never put a lead ox behind a lead ox because that other ox will actually refuse to move because it doesn't want to surrender the authority that it has. Okay? Now, the reason why this is so important is because now we understand what it means to be tame for the yoke is that you are actually able to lead. Okay? So now when we bring this back to this idea of taming, we know that he's doing something to whatever it is that the subject of that verb is going to be. The second thing that's going to be very important is to identify that in all of that process, there is something very specific that is being tamed for leadership. Okay, so we'll get to that momentarily. So now you understand that the word cease is a very horrible translation of this word in Hebrew. And interestingly enough, the word cease itself, let's take a look at this real quick. The word cease itself is actually used 206 times. But it's so diversely translated that it's only actually used for ceasing or stopping, right? In the sense of a completion, actually 0 times. 44 times is end, 20 times is finish, right? Let's say 9 times is done, 7 times is ended, right? But then we've got weird stuff like fainteth and fail and accomplish, where they're completely diametrically opposed in definition. Fail and accomplish are completely opposites of each other, and yet this word is being pushed in that direction. Now, there's all kinds of stuff we could get into, because obviously one of the things we got to remember, I mean, and this is very important, is the Jewish Publication Society is saying those same things about this word, even though that they speak Hebrew and know that that's not how that word works. Why? Because there is actually a consistency of translation between the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible, so that in such a way that they're not necessarily in conflict with each other. Now, you say, you know what, you're making some bold claims here, dude. You're trying to say that even people who speak the language are misinterpreting it. Yes, because you can't figure out the word for English. But I can get you close with the taming, okay? I can get you close with the taming. I can get you close with the idea that it's a preparation for something, for a work, which we're going to get into in a minute. Okay. So now the next thing that we need to do is say, okay, now we are going to identify what is the next, what is the actual subject of the word, okay? Now, so the first thing that we need to do is accept that every single Hebrew word is a verb. There are variations of verbs that come close to creating verbal nouns, but there's no such thing as a noun in Hebrew. You say, well, how is that possible? How do we describe a person, place, or thing? By their action. By their action. An example of this is the word Rapha, which means, well, so from a conjugation perspective, literally says he healed, okay? But in the idea of a lexical form, it is in the infinitive definition of to heal, okay, which is a verbal noun. But the idea behind Rapha is healing, okay? So the concept or the context of the entire usage of the word is healing, which means what? Everything that goes into healing. So the person doing it, the person who's ailing, the method by which to do the healing in the first place. So what's interesting is in Hebrew, we call a doctor a rofeh, which is actually, interestingly enough, the present tense participle translation of that word. Meaning what? It's an ing. It's literally saying healing. So a doctor is a healing. So interestingly enough, we say rofeh, we're actually saying the word healing, which means we are naming a thing after its action. Well, that's very different from English, where we have nouns to designate persons, places, or things, and we have verbs to designate the actions that we do or do to them, okay? So we have objects of verbs and subjects of verbs, but that's really not how it works in the Hebrew. Now, having said that, we still have this concept of subject verb object, which is where it gets a little bit confusing because for all intents and purposes, the Aramaic adaptation of the action or of the usage of Hebrew is going to be verb, subject, object, okay? Whereas in English, we do subject, verb, object. Okay, so for example, if I say I throw a ball, okay? So throwing the ball itself is the actual action. I is the subject. I throw, right? The ball is the object. If I throw the ball to you, you are actually the indirect object, which makes the ball the direct object. The action is being done to the ball, not to you. Me throwing it to you causes you to be an indirect object of the verb. Now, the reason why this is so important is because when we're working with the Hebrew, you're going to see that this verb actually comes first. Let me show you. So it literally says, and he ceased, right? So in the Hebrew, that's how it starts. And he ceased, right? Okay. But it's not until here that it actually is mentioned, right? So what's interesting is this is how it reads. And he ceased. Whoops. And he ceased. Okay. Elohim bayom hashvi'i, which is what? In the day seventh. Malaketo, melaketo, asher asa. And then it goes into yishvot, bayom hashvi'i. So that's a repeat, right? Here's hashvi'i. Whoops. And here is, and then here is, oh yeah, I'm in the Hebrew over here, right? Oh, we got that spinning circle of death. That's pleasant. Okay, so it's right here. So we've got hashvi'i, and then we've got melakto, okay? But now watch this. We also have it here. We've got bayom hashvi'i, and we've got malakto asher asa. Now watch this. Malakto asher asa. So really what's interesting is the actual only words that are unique in this is that first word, vayikal, and the second word, vayishvot. Now, it's translated as finished, which we now is tamed. We now know is tamed. So it says, on the seventh day, God tamed his work of creation, and so he rested. Okay? Now, there's a footnote here that says ceased, right? Ceased. So he rested or he ceased. And in fact, if we go into the actual, if we go into the first verse, we have that same thing, right? We have that vayakol, and actually it's vayakolu, which is basically that he did it to multiple things. What did he do it to? He did it to hashamayim, and he did it to vehaaretz, which is basically saying he did it to the heavens and the earth, right? He tamed the heavens and the earth. And then what? Look at this. Vekol, all, very different from this word here, by the way, just so you know. All is basically all inclusive. And then what's this one? Seva'am, right? Was completed, Seva'am. And if we go into the ancient, or we go into the Hebrew, we can find Seva'am is from Seva, which means what? That which went forth, okay? In fact, very specifically has to do with armies, but that's another story. Now, in the Hebrew or in the English, what it says it says, so the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. Okay. Now, in other versions, for example, I believe probably King James is going to say host, right? So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. Nope. I guess we didn't get that opportunity. Oh, yes, we did. Okay, there we go. Host, right? Right there in host. Okay. Now, I've spent a lot of time on this screen, so I'm going to pull back for just a minute. What you have learned so far proves that this translation is a horrible example to really get our minds wrapped around Sabbath, because why? Everything you believe about Sabbath so far has been about what you read in the English, not what you read in the Hebrew, because you don't speak Hebrew. You don't interact with the Hebrew culture or with the understanding. What do I mean by understanding? I mean that there is a what and a why of the way in which the Hebrew culture works. Okay, very different from your culture now. In fact, your culture is extremely Greek. Your buildings are Greek. Your verbs and nouns are Greek. Your prefixes are Greek. Para, meta, right? Bio, or they're I think bio is actually Latin. But the premise is that your prefixes are not Hebrew. Your lifestyle is not Hebrew. Your Bible is Hebrew, which means what? There is a conflict of interest. Because if you're an American Protestant Christian, I got a heartbreaker for you. Your God, whom you claim to be your God, which I accept, if you really want that God to be your God, and that one is the one who so loved the world he gave his only begotten Son, which consequently is for you a belief that you are now preserved from a system that is predetermined to be destructive. Those are your acceptances. Wrote you the letter in Hebrew. Basic instructions before leaving earth, Hebrew. Love letter from God through Christ, Hebrew. Which means what? You need to get over the fact that you're not Jewish and understand the culture of the ancient Hebrew nomad, because that is who was the father of all your faith, who consequently created a culture of Hebrew that was so foreign from the culture of that day that it was a shock to people who encountered him. This man who conquers kings and then returns the plunder. This man who tells a king to his face, I want nothing from you because I never want you to say that you gave it. Tells a king to his face. This man who's blessed by what appears to be the King of Kings while in the Valley of the Kings, who is not a king, but is instead a conqueror of kings. That man was a nomad and a Hebrew, not a Christian, not a Jew, not an Israelite. Okay? So the father of all who believe, according to Paul, is an ancient nomadic Hebrew. Okay? Okay. So now what we need to do is we need to say, okay, so taming is very different from completing, right? Remember at the beginning I said this thing about fulfillment? Remember I said that fulfillment in and of itself never says completed? Now some people say, well, wait a minute now. Isn't there this concept that if you're empty and you get filled, then you are complete and therefore you don't need anything? Yes, of course. The concept of shalom says, may you be complete and in need of nothing. But guess what? If you don't pour back out that completion, it will be taken from you. For he who has, it will be taken from him. Because of the whole concept of stewardship. Here is your money. I buried it in the ground. Get him out of here. Here's your money. I put it in the bank. I made money off it. Here's the interest. Good. You were faithful in a little, you got a little, you did the little thing. Good job. You're on the right track. Now you made me money. So guess what? You're in charge of all my household now. You get his position now, right? And this guy over here, go cut off his head. So the premise is this concept or this idea in which now we understand that taming is very different from completing. Okay? I already proved this to you in the cycles teaching when I said one of the things that we need to conclude in the beginning of the cycles teachings would have been way back in like October or November of last year. I said, we can plausibly conclude that creation has continued, and here's why. And we did a whole entire sermon on it, right? Okay, so now getting back to our text, let's go into this other word. Because remember, all the other words are the same, and we'll analyze those as well. Whoops, I got to go back actually into the second verse. Okay, so remember, all the other words are the same. So we've got Bayom Hashvi'i Malkuto, Asher, I'm sorry, Malketo, Asher, Asa, okay? And then it repeats it again with some with one word in between, which is from all, okay, which we'll mess with later on. Okay, so now what we need to do is look at this right here, okay, which is vayishvot, okay. So vayishvot is actually going to be the word Shabbat. If you are an Israeli Savra, you say Shavath with a TH. If you are an Ashkenazi, you say Shavos. And if you are a Mediterranean Sephardic, then you say Shavat. Okay, and so for all intents and purposes, we will say Shavat. I can tell you the Zondervan Basics of Biblical Hebrew taught me to say Shabbat. So that's what we're going to go with. Okay, to cease, desist, and rest. Okay, let's talk about this a minute. So some people think that resting is sleeping. Okay, so they say, well, on Shabbat, I'm going to take a nap and I'm going to sleep. And of course, I will tell you, after I stood up here for 2 hours and then went in Midrash with y'all for another 2 hours, it's night time. But that does not have anything to do with Shabbat. That has to do with me being exhausted and tired enough to need to sleep. Okay. Now I can call it a Shabbat nap, and I can tell you some very interesting visions and dreams occur during that nap. But we need to be honest here. We need to be truthful. We need to actually say what is actually happening during the Shabbat. Now, I'm going to get back to you on this. So the premise is that this is decease or rest. Okay, so let's do our thing again. Copy this. Go into our search and of course do the Strong's Concordance number. You guys know the drill here. What's one thing we can say about the Shabbat that we can't say about the other word? We can say that this is actually an adopted root, okay? And in fact, you'll see here, AR, adopted root. But let's look at it. The ceasing of work or other activity in order to rest. Sitting in order to rest. Okay, let's go see. Let's get back to our parent root. Might take a moment to get there, but I'm just gonna nonchalantly show you the other words that are present in this little word system. Okay, here we go. So this is parent root, shin bait. It means to draw, turn, capture, sit, design, or weave. In the concrete, it is a seat, it is a well, it is a captive, it is a breath, it is a net, it is a plate, it is a bed. Now, in the abstract, it is anguish or copulation. So let's take a look at it. Let's talk about it. First and foremost, let's go document some things on the board. So we have our word, sheen, atrocious Hebrew, I apologize. Sheen bait, right? Sheen bait tav, sheen bait tav. And of course, is this a child root? No, it does not contain a yod, hey, vav, aleph, or doubled last letter, does it? No, it does not. So we need to go ahead and accept that in some cases, it's very apparent what the word is actually communicating. So in this case, it's sheen. It's actually two front teeth. We'll just draw our guy with the two front teeth, right? Big old grin and his two front teeth, which is actually the sheen, right? Okay, so that's the premise there. Then we have what? The bait, which is this drawing, this like basically this evolved pictograph of a tent, right? But it represents tent. We know it does. We've done the research, not an issue. And then, of course, we have this X. Okay. And what do we know? We know right off the bat, we can just openly admit, we can accept that this is actually the parent root. Okay. For a few reasons, which we'll get into in a minute. Okay. But now the premise is that this is the odd one out, and we kind of need to find a home for it, and we'll get there. Now, what's important is that we can look at the entire grouping of stems. Let me explain a stem to you. A stem is actually a letter grouping that basically is made up from the parent root. Now, a stem usually has a third letter added to the parent root, which is a double pair, a letter pair, or a pictograph pair. So the way that they did their language and the evolution of their language was simply that there were letter pairs, and we found this on pottery. And those letter pairs mean a combination of the two in order to accomplish a defined action. Remember, there are no verbs. There are no nouns. Okay, so then our letter pair, sheen bait, has a very important thing with it. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at that really quick. And when I say there's an important thing with it, what I mean is that the definition itself really kind of explains the level of Hebrew culture that we're working with here. Okay. So that's not the right screen. That's the right screen. Okay. So now here is the concept. The pictograph sheen, which consequently is that guy right here, the pictograph sheen, is what? Is the picture of two front teeth. Okay? The idea of representation of cutting, crushing, or pressing. Okay? Pressing. Okay? Now, the bait, let's go back to this. The bait, that one right there, is the picture of a tent. Combine these mean press to the tent. A place. Now this is the nomadic definition. What does that mean? This is the part where Abraham, instead of doing what everybody's done, let me just really quick illustrate this for you. In the time of Abraham, there were some very important events occurring. Number one, there were geological events occurring. The world was breaking up. And so there was a level of discomfort, of fear about the future, fear about existence, present in such a way that many of the people gathered themselves into one place just like they did in Shinar when they created Babylon and their tower, right? They gather themselves in one place and they create these cities with walls that are called city states, which are contents of basically thousands of people who have gathered in order to feel safe together. The natural human instinct to herd together is present in the city state. Now, two things that are very important. The ones who actually have the resources to feed, protect, etc., are the rulers of the city. So whoever basically had the most assets to provide those things to the people actually was the leader or king. So did Sodom come from a line of royal rulers? Did the king of Sodom come from a line of royal rulers? No, probably not. What he probably had was a really good sheep shearing business or had a really good cattle business, and therefore he was the boss. He was the head dude, right? Had nothing whatsoever to do with lineage or inheritance or any of that stuff. It just had to do with if you were the baddest dude in the city, then you were the king, okay? So they have these city states, and within these city states, they have these things called teraphim, which are basically gods that are actual statues that are set up to represent all of the different difficulties that are contained within the city. Now, part of that is going to be a political move. You're going to set up a statue and say, bring all your stuff to this statue, and then we won't have any problems. Now, some of that can be absolutely superstition, and some of that can be a political move to control the people. In fact, the the archives of Babylon actually say that Nebuchadnezzar did not believe in any gods. He was an atheist. And the truth is that he used the gods to accomplish his tasks. He was a political master at manipulating the people, and he did it through the pantheon. Okay, now the reason why that's important is because Abraham, through his philosophy concerning Yahweh and the tent and provision, protection, and instruction, forms the nomadic lifestyle. The nomadic lifestyle that actually prevents him from going. These are like his non-negotiables. He will not go into the city and be dependent on them. He will be self-reliant. He will actually be able to move his family to food and water, whereas the cities are stuck doing what they're doing. And there has to be some sort of resource near where they build the cities. Guys, it's a no-brainer that Jerusalem was built on a spring. Okay? As was Jericho. And so when we're working with the city states, when we're dealing with these people, you need to understand Abraham was not going to be a part of it. He also refused to be a part of their culture. I don't like what you believe. I don't like what you do. I don't like how you live. I'm not going to be a part of it. This is how I'm going to live because I've learned from the creator of the universe that this is how you live. Meaning what? Yahweh actually produced the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle, culture, philosophy. So in that way, when we get into the nomadic definition, this is Abraham's definition. Look at this. A place of dwelling as the place returned to, a turning back or away from someone or something. A captive is turned away from the place of dwelling. Okay. So let's talk a minute about the philosophical element of the sheen bait. Okay. So now we have this concept that chewing with the mouth is pressing down on the food. And so we literally have this idea that if we press with the body into something, we are creating a pressure or an intensity. In fact, there is actually certain Hebrew words that use the pressure to indicate stress. And so the concept of two front teeth representing those words, watch this, I'm about to show you. The two front teeth representing the pressing and then the moving towards the tent. Why? What is the reason you were outside the tent? This becomes powerful because we're going to go back into our verse and see how beautifully constructed this verse in chapter 2 of Genesis is. Okay. So the whole idea is there's only one reason to legitimately leave the tent, and that is to tame the animals, feed the animals, cultivate the ground, plant, sow, cultivate, and harvest. And that's it. And all of those are where there is a separation between the masculine testosterone infused body and the feminine estrogen infused body. While he's out here doing that work, taming the animals, cultivating the land, etc., the amount of oxytocin starts to diminish. The testosterone overrides the oxytocin. And so now what can he do? He can go out and slaughter an animal for dinner and not cry while he's doing it. He can go out and he can be very heartless and cold and methodical in taming, which requires you to discipline the animal. An animal you love, but at the moment you need it to be functional. The same is true of the crops. He can be methodical. He can create a state in which he has to really tap into putting your head down and pushing through, right? That's testosterone. Now, when he looks towards the tent, his mind remembers the bond between the child he held in those first moments of eye contact when oxytocin is at its strongest in a father. And it goes back to the basic instinct of an animal that if there's a strong bonding between the father and the child, that the child will not be eaten by the animal. Okay? And so the mother doesn't necessarily have to protect the animal from the father. The father has an emotional bond to the child. Now, granted, we as humans aren't going to be eating our children unless, of course, you're Israel in a famine, and then that's exactly what they did. But the premise is that basically when you have that connection, now there's a context. So when he sees the tent afar off, he sees what? He experiences empathy. He experiences compassion, a connection to the tent. And that causes him to press towards the tent when his work is, his taming and his cultivating is completed as a result of the sun going down. The sun going down, he can see afar off the fire. He can see the flame from the clan itself, and he knows to return to the tent. This in Hebrew is known as teshuvah or repentance. But the key is that there is a turning from the non-compassionate function of work and turning back to the tent and moving towards the tent, towards compassion, towards empathy, which emboldens the body that is estrogen infused, emboldens her to what? Be the protector, etc., etc. Now, the premise here, and it is an important one, is now you can see the culture of the ancient Hebrew nomad built into his language. So when it says that it is the word ceasing, we need to understand it is not ceasing in the sense of abandoning or stopping forever. As soon as the sun rises, where is he going to go? Back out the tent, and he's going to tame and cultivate. Tame, oh, that's the word used in the beginning of that verse, right? Okay, so what does that mean? That means that contained in this verse is a returning to the tent because he's been out taming. It says he tamed the heavens and the earth and all of its host. And then it says he tamed. On the seventh day, he tamed. And then what happens? As he tamed, then he teshuvas, he turns back. He turns himself back towards the tent and proceeds towards the tent. He's the clan leader. He's the authority. He's the cultivator. He's the tamer. Now returning to the tent where his lesser, the bride, is waiting for him to come back to that moment. And what is actually drawing him back to the tent? What's pressing him? What's pulling him? The memory of the bonding. What's making him come home? The memory of the bonding. Well, then we need to ask the question, where did this bonding occur between him and the bride, between him and the children? That's for another sermon. But the premise is now what we really need to get into is what are the other words contained in this? So we've got Shabbat, which literally means seat. But I want you to see something very important from this word Shabbat, okay? If you haven't noticed, it is actually feminine. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, okay? So now we've got shavav, which means to be broken, to break into pieces, okay? And that's that idea of separating the pieces out, but then bringing them back together, okay? And then we've got shaviv, which is a flame. We've got shavav, or shovav, which is a backsliding or turning or a mind changing, right? We've got sha'av, which means to draw water, to bring up water from a well, usually using a rope or a bucket to cause it to return from where it is down below. Mishav is a well, which is actually going to be basically Sheva is going to be what a well is, right? Mishav is a well for drawing water. Then we've got Shava, a forcible turning away from one's homeland to another place. Let's talk a minute about that. So now what have the Hebrews done? They're adding something into the sheen bait. So what's the sheen bait? Press towards the tent, creating a returning, right? A relation or a relation. He's returning to his relatives. Relat is to laterally return, laterally move back and forth. Okay, so here's the concept. Now what we have is we have a hay being added. Well, what's the hay? That is the pictograph of the observer or the beholder. So who would be standing outside observing somebody being turned away? But somebody who's actually, when they're observing somebody being turned away, they are the captor. They're turning somebody away from the tent and moving them away. And let me tell you, there's plenty of ramifications about what I just said. If someone is turned away from the tent, it is the captor who is causing that to happen. Okay, and so here's the concept. To capture, right? So shava means to capture. The act of catching, willing, or gaining control by force, stratagem, or guile to take one away from his homeland as an involuntary prisoner. So then we have shavot, which is what? The state or period of being imprisoned, enslaved, or confined. Shavit, right? And a shvi is a captive, a person who is enslaved or dominated. Shvi'ah is captive. Shuv, a turning back to a previous state or place. Shuv, to turn back, to return to a previous place or state. And then we've got the Aramaic word tuv, right? Tuv, which is the same word. Then we've got shuv'ah, right? Turning back. Teshuva, to turn back. As a reply, as a return, right? Then we've got mishva, mishuva, which is basically a backslider or turning back or a changing of the mind in what we believe or what we honor. And then a yeshav is a place of dwelling as a place to return to. Now watch how this culturally starts to fall together. So we've got yeshav, which means to settle, which is what? It is the concept of returning to the tent and being present in the tent, to stay in a dwelling place for the night or for long periods of time, right? And then we've got moshav, settling, the place of sitting, resting, or dwelling, usually temporary. Then we've got toshav, a sojourner or one who temporarily stays or travels from place to place. We've got shiv, which is basically to return. And then we've got tashav, the process of designing a pattern or plan for an action or device, turning over thoughts, right? And then we've got tashav, to think or plan or design. Chashav, to think or plan or design a course of action, item, or invention, which consequently that's the word chashvot, is imaginations. Chashvot. Then we've got cheshev, which is a decorative band, so something that's been designed, right? And then we've got machshava, which is an invention, right? A product of imagination, designing or planning of inventions or plans, right? Then we've got chashvon or cheshvan, right? Which is what? An invention, a designed device. And then we've got chishvon, which is also an invention. And then we've got a cognate savach, right? Savach means to interweave. I'm not going to explain cognates today. And then that starts to get into net, right? It starts to get into an interwoven thing. So you can see where these start to derive from that original returning to the tent, right? And then we've got triangle from the concept of a netting, because you tie knots in a certain way that they create triangles in the net, because that's the strongest shape in the universe. And a thicket or a thicket or a bush, right, which is a savoch. You can see where this is all deriving from this idea of returning to the tent. And then a wreath or woven band. Then we've got shavah. Now this is very important. Before we go any further in this, before I touch on this word, I want you to really think about what has happened here. Yahweh has tamed. Now he's returning to the tent because of the memory of the relationship that he has with the ones in the tent. He's been out taming the heavens and the earth. Now he's returning to the tent because someone is in there who's special enough to return to, right? There is a desire to actually go back to that dwelling place. But here's something really amazing, and this is one that has always kind of blown my mind, okay? Remember it said Yom Hashvi'i, the seventh day, okay? The seventh day. What you need to know is the word or the number 7 has nothing to do with counting in the sense of there being an ordinal number that represents the seventh thing or is the actual number 7. Instead, it's an action that you complete in the state of making covenant, which is that you state what you will do 7 times. And it's called sevening yourself. Okay? And so what it should really read in the Hebrew is in the day of the oath. Now, we're going to take it a step further after that in a minute. But the best way I could put it to you is what it's actually saying here is that he made an oath. There's an oath that happened on this day, which we'll get to that word day in a minute. Okay, so now it says literally to seven oneself. A common practice was to make 7 declarations when making an oath. This declaration can be making the oath 7 times or doing 7 things to show sincerity of the oath. Has anybody heard of the idea that if you do things 7 times, you actually form a habit? This is kind of where that concept comes from. Okay, and I say kind of because obviously I'm not going to force you to believe that. Okay, so now look at this. It does not mean 7. It means to swear, to completely submit to a promise or an oath with words and spoken 7 times. This is coming from what? From that original word, to press to the tent, which means swearing has something to do with pressing to the tent. Let's keep going. Of course, we got the cardinal number, all that kind of stuff. Of course we do. But it is now a week, a period of time consisting of 7 days or 7 years. Why? Because it is the last thing, completed during the creation process. The 7th day is the last thing completed during the creation process. Let's move past these ordinal stuff and let's look at this word, Shabbat. It is Aramaic, actually, right? The crisscross pattern of weaving. So now we're back to weaving again. The Arameans really were interested in weaving as part of their tent process. Okay. And then finally we get to Shabbat. Now, when we get to Shabbat, we have to ask the question, if the parent root is to press towards the tent, what is the tav? Now it says the ceasing of work or activity in order to rest. Now I've already somewhat given you an understanding that the idea of something coming to rest is a very chaotic process. Okay? Now I'm going to get a little bit crazy here in a minute, but the premise is to come to an end, to die out, to stop an activity for the purpose of the rest or for celebration. Okay? Ceasing, a stopping of work or activity, an activity curtailed before completion. The 7th day of the week, often translated as Sabbath, when all business ceases for the rest and celebration, right? And then Mishvat is a ceasing. In fact, just so you guys know, when you put a mem in front of a verb, it means ing. So cease becomes ceasing, okay? And then we've got Shabbaton, which is a day of rest, but very specifically going to be related to the feast days, which he doesn't really mention here. And then here's the one. This is one right here. Let me tell you. If there was no other derivation of this premise, this truly is the key to the whole process of the word Shabbat. But you have to get this first. What causes the return to the tent? All right, here we go. Shakav, a laying down for copulation. Shakav, to lay down, to give up, to lie down for copulation, rest, or sleep. Now, we're going to kind of intertwine those, but then we're going to go ahead and remove the anthropomorphic mess that it is, okay? So what do we have? Let's look at this practically as adults, communicating with adults. There's probably not a question as to what's actually going on in the bedroom behind the closed door when the testosterone infused body and the estrogen infused body come together in the bed. Okay? But what transpires after is as effective in its information as what transpires during. And what I mean by that is we know that oxytocin, which is the thing that gets suppressed when you got to go kill something so that there's food on the table, or when you got to go tame something, which means you have to be authoritative and not compassionate, or you are caught up in the sentiment of nest and process of nurturing an environment. Both of those come together in the process of oxytocin, and pheromones are released that indicate that oxytocin is present. And when it detects itself, it increases itself, it intensifies itself all the way to a climax. And then what? A cool down period in which that then subsides and the two hormones start to balance back out again, testosterone and estrogen, and they become those two pieces. But during that oxytocin, there is such a bonding that even when you were apart from one another, the memory of that moment is actually intoxicating. The memory of that moment is actually distracting to the hormonal processes that have now separated from each other. The reason why that's important is because you need to realize that the shechav is actually what creates the shuv. In other words, the copulation or the intimate moment of the oxytocin mixing creates such a bond that it creates a shuv, a return to the tent. He's out doing his thing, but when he looks back towards that tent, he remembers that moment. So now we understand why he would move towards the tent. So now let's take all that anthropomorphic stuff and tweak it to understand what it actually is going to be in terms of these energies, because we know that God is spirit, and that is unfortunately the word pneuma, which really kind of messes up the definition of what that means. But the concept is that there's no anthropomorphic assignments actually present within the intensification of all power in the universe, but instead a combining of energies, and very specifically a placing of a seed of spark of light within the womb of a feminine principle that was designed to receive all of his benevolence unconditionally through bestowal. Meaning what? She cannot give anything to him. She's not capable of it, because in order for him to receive something, he actually has to be less than the thing that's giving to him. Which means what? He ceases to be God. He ceases to be the intensification of all power in the universe. Which means she, in a state of of free will choose to receive all of his benevolence through his bestowal and not through his reception. Meaning that the concept of intercourse or copulation in the process shows that when he did the shuv back to the tent, it was because of the intimate process that had already occurred. So this taming of the heavens and the earth, which consequently there's a lot we could get into with that. What is taming? It's a priming for leadership, right? Now here's the premise, and this is an important one. Now we go back to the Shabbat. And now what we need to do when we're going back to the Shabbat is we need to go to the board. We need to discuss this more. Okay? So first of all, as you all know, and this is important, I'm just going to use this color right here to really lay this out for you. This is the parent root. But what is this? That letter right there is our most important piece. And you notice I can put the word press right here, right? And I can put tent right here. But truth be told is that whole thing is augmenting that premise right there. So what is that premise? What is that concept? What is that context? What is the Tav? Well, there's a number of things that we need to get into concerning the Tav. The first thing that we need to get into is the actual pictographic definition of the Tav. And we're going to go to the ancient Hebrew language and alphabet book to really get our heads wrapped around that. And so running back to the beginning where the definitions are, we will start to better understand the Tav. Okay. So let's see, let's get over to our, let's see, we need just the letters themselves. I will, by the way, I'll share my screen here in a minute. I was on the wrong screen there. So what we're looking for is going to be, let's just go ahead and share it. So what we're looking for is where we have just the individual letters and their definitions, okay? So we see here, starting with the Aleph, we have the pictographic form. All sources agree that the original form for this letter is this drawing right here, okay? An ox. And the mnemonic meaning is muscle, right? The strongest of things. The yoke is the ox placed in a yoke, right? And the load for plowing, right, is chief or an older experienced ox. So now you could see where that works, right? But now when we get over into the Tav, which is way over here at the end, remember it goes Aleph all the way through Tav. So that's actually our last letter. We are going to encounter this mechanism of Shabbat. And here it is. The ancient picture, which is the drawing of a cross, and don't get it twisted, okay? When I say cross, what I mean is that this is what it represented. This is not the cross of Christ or any of that other junk that Christianity wants to try to assign to a pagan symbol that a pagan king used to try to unite his kingdom. A type of mark, probably of two sticks crossed to mark a place similar to the Egyptian hieroglyph that is two crossed sticks. Now here's the mnemonic: mark, signature, or identification as a marker to identify people, places, or things. Room, desert, dwelling as marked. I'm sorry, desert, dwelling as marked. The symbol, the modern Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek names for this letter is Tav. The meaning or mark of this letter retains the two original letter words. The Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic agree that the sound for this letter is T. Okay? Now, that is the actual story or whatever you will behind it. But now let's go ahead and let's move over to the actual pictographic definition, and this will be very, very important. And that is going to be represented in the Tav. Okay. So a sign or mark is used as a sign to identify someone or something. Okay. But the word itself uses the Tav and the Vav. So let's go to the Vav real quick. That's where we get Tav, well, Tau in the ancient, Tau. But that Vav is very important in this letter pair, okay? And that is going to be here. So it is a tent peg. Ropes attached to pegs driven into the ground supported the tent. These pegs were made of branched pieces of hardwood, preventing ropes from slipping off the peg. So the premise is that this is the wa, or vav, as we call it in modern speak. This letter was used both as a consonant and a vowel, but it is definitely used as a joiner or a conjunction. It means and. But look at the meaning here. Secure. A peg is used to secure the tent in place. This letter can also mean to add, as a peg or nail can be used to add something to something else, okay? Or to connect. So it's a connector. So now what's interesting is we have the tet and the tav and the vav, meaning basically sign is established or sign is secure, or the essence is secure. Okay. Now, there's a couple things that are very important. First one is what is this? The whole idea behind the Tav is the representation of the clan itself. Whether that be in a state of reputation, it's not really all that relevant. But the idea that there is actually an extant defining uniqueness to the clan is brought out in a banner or brought out in a signature or a signet that represents that clan. So the whole idea is that the securing of the clan would come in the form of covenant in one of three ways. First, if that clan was small and the other clan was bigger, then that other clan, that small clan, would say to this clan, you were bigger than me, so let us please join together, and my land will be your land, my weapons will be your weapons, my women will marry your men, my sons will marry your daughters, and we will be in covenant in such a way that if somebody comes who's bigger than us both, combined, we will actually have power. Now, the bigger clan has benefit of more land and benefit of marrying, etc., etc. The smaller clan has the benefit of protection and potentially provision. Together, the small parts make up the whole, which is a very, very important part of the Sheen bait. The small parts make up the whole. Why does he turn his face back towards the tent? Because of the intimacy he experienced when he held the child in his hands and the oxytocin flowed, or he held the woman in his arms and the oxytocin flowed and intensified and intensified and intensified, creating a permanent bonding beyond emotional attachments, of course, because obviously emotional attachments start to diminish the oxytocin. But the premise is that when it is said and done, the concept of Teshuvah and shuv have to do with the intimacy that you experienced to begin with, or the shekav, the laying down for copulation. So now we have this idea of this shuv, but then we have this tav on the end. And since this is in the place, let me go ahead and go to the board here real quick. Since the sheen bait, which I will indicate to you in, let's say, blue, I will just put a little bit of a dotted line around, is in the place of honor. So let's talk about that for a minute. Honor, okay? It's in the place of honor, which means what? It is actually the decision. Let's talk about that for a minute. It's actually the decision maker. So here's how this works. Since the dawn of humanity, one of the things that we can probably 100% depend on is the entropy or the settling or the breaking down of the body. As reductionist, we could say that it is just a heat engine, and when it can no longer produce heat, it ceases to function. Okay? So in that premise or in that information, we now start to get the picture of there being a necessity for a legacy beyond the life itself, which we're going to touch upon when we get into the greater details of this message. So the premise is that what you really need to kind of get your mind wrapped around is the idea that there is something carried beyond the momentary existence. That's called legacy. So when you have a point in time in your life when you no longer are the one who can go out and tame the animals or cultivate the ground or cultivate the field, then you have to have somebody who replaces you. And when somebody replaces you, they need to be able to recreate the process in order for it to be successful, which means you mentor and you take under your wing, so to speak, that individual. And that individual is usually the firstborn child in your family that is male. So the premise is that that male child is then considered to be the actual one who does what you used to do. You are now grandpa, so to speak, and he is the actual owner, manager, and operator of the family business or of the clan's business. Which means what? He's the shot caller. He's the one who says, this is what this needs to be, and here's how it works. And the only time that that's not true is if the father, the original clan leader, determines that that one is not actually operating as a leader, he can displace him. Now, in all of that process, now you understand that the right hand, the son of my right hand, is actually the one who would be running the business, right? And so the son of my right hand is in the position of honor. And if he's in the position of honor, that means he actually has the authority and not me. I honor his authority. Figure that one out. I, as the father, the clan leader, as the creator and progenitor of the entire clan itself, submit to the authority of the one in a position of honor, and it's true in the grammar itself. Let me show you. So if we kind of establish that this has to do with secure the name, that's basically what we're working with here, okay? Is secure the name. Then all of this actually modifies this. Meaning what? Return to the tent in order to secure the name is actually what the word Sabbath means. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. What name is actually being secured? Is the name of the one who, and here's the thing, is in English, we have a sentimental attachment to the individual in a unique designator called a name. But in Hebrew, you actually determine the course of a person's life by what you name them. And when you give a Hebrew name to someone, even if they have already been born, maybe they were born uncircumcised, maybe they actually were not a Jew to begin with, and now they have become a Jew, depending on the synagogue, the rabbi will rename them in order for them to take upon themselves a new identity. Now, in all of that process and in all of that function, the name of the family is now upon the shoulders of the firstborn, not the patriarch. The firstborn now has been given precedence as the one who will receive the honor of the name. Okay? So now we have Abraham, and then seated at his right hand is Isaac, who is son of Abraham. Isaac ben Avraham. But Avraham is not the name of the patriarch, but the action that it would become. And so Avraham, being the father of all peoples, now is Isaac, son of father of all peoples, or Isaac, continuer of father of all peoples. So you see the concept here is that Isaac now is in authority. He's the shot caller for the actual, for the family business. Now, it is very important for you to understand that that is a very nomadic pastoral lifestyle that we're talking about. But the premise that we really need to get into here is the concept of securing the name, and which means what? Which means there is a continuance of the name. So what in the world does that have to do with the Sabbath? Well, to briefly touch on that, to really bring that concept forward, we need to understand the word day, number one, and we need to understand that it doesn't mean day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but instead each one of the names of those numbers is an action of creation itself. Now, this is a taste of the Genesis in the Image of God series, but one of the things that you need to get your mind wrapped around is that there was no rising and falling of the sun that determines our daytime, that determines our biological cycle on day 1 of creation. Meaning it means something else. Well, I'm just going to put out there without a whole lot of explanation. I'm just going to put in there and insert that the word day or yom does not mean what you think it means. It actually means an established work in chaos. What does that mean? That means a predetermined action of chaos in order to create order. I don't think anybody's really ready for that, because then we start to get into the idea that the word light itself does not mean photon emission, but instead means order, or better yet, strong mind. And so now we get into this crazy idea. What is Shabbat? If day 1 or Yom Echad is actually a work in chaos of unity, because that's what echad means, unity, then we ironically have a concept that when it says Yom Shvi'i, Yom Hashvi'i, it literally is saying the work in chaos of the oath. What oath? The covenantal oath of that Tav. If we want to really understand the Tav in and of itself, we will understand that it represents covenant, promise, and that Shvi'i itself, or Sheva, which is the number 7, actually means to unconditionally and completely throw yourself under the authority of a promise by stating it 7 times. And so, in the work and chaos of the oath, he tamed something. He tamed the heavens and the earth in verse 1. But in verse 2, he tames something else. And that is going to be the conclusion of this message. And that something else is the malacha. The malacha, okay? So now getting back over into Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, we will start to see this process. So the word we're looking for is this one here, which is malakat. Oh, I'm sorry. It's going to be it's melaketo. And from that, we derive malacha, which is occupation, work, or business. But let's really get our minds wrapped around it by jumping back to the root word, malak. Malak. So what is malak? What does it come from? What's it derived from? Well, interestingly enough, we have another wonderful mapping of Hebrew pictographs into this verse 2. Why? I'll show you. Going back into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible. That's not it. Going back in the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, we have here a definition of the word malakha, having its derivation, having its origin, parent root, literally going to be the lamed kaf. Lamed kaf. Well, there's a familiarity. Weren't we already working with taming as being the kaf lamed? What has happened here? Why have we gone from tame for the yoke to the opposite of that? Look at this. The lamed is, I've already shown you these pictographs. I don't even need to do that. The lamed is a picture of a shepherd's staff. The kaf is a picture of a palm. Combine these means staff in the palm. Whoa. Just watch this now. I'm gonna put this up on the board. I'm gonna show you this. So on the one side, we've got the kaf lamed, which means tame for the yoke, right? But on the other side, we've got lamed kaf, means king. Do you remember that taming for the yoke was the preparation for leadership? Now watch this, and this is important. The concept here is one of preparation for this. Now, let me show you what's happening here. Remember, I said that the son of the right hand, okay? The son of the right hand is that letter right there, which means what? It's augmenting that one, which means tame first for the yoke, right? Tame for the yoke, or tame for the authority. Okay? Now watch this. The letters flip. Honor is given to the lamed, who now becomes the augmenter, and instead of it being tame for the yoke, it's staff in hand. Now, let me explain to you what's going on here. the concept, I'll use my glass because I need to sip anyways. Watch this now. The hand is conforming to the shape of the glass so that it can hold the glass. Do you see this? That I'm actually putting my hand around it and making the shape of the glass. There's a taper to my hand and everything so that the glass doesn't fall. If my hand is not tight enough here, then there's a concept of it falling, right? So actually conforming to the glass gives me the ability to hold the glass. Oh man, I don't think it's sunk in yet. So me submitting to the authority of the glass gives me the ability to hold the glass. Now I have taken hold of the glass. I'm holding it. So who's in control of the glass right now? But what did I have to do to get control of the glass? I had to conform to it. Now watch this. The powerful symbolism behind the Kaf Lamed, when the Lamed is the augmenting letter, is staff in hand, where the hand is conforming to the staff. In order to hold the staff, you have to submit to the shape of the staff in order to be the authority who holds the staff. You have to accept the staff and receive the staff as your symbol of authority. So now the grasping of this is going to become very powerful. You go from being tamed to, which is what? Preparation for leadership, to being the leader by taking hold of the staff, taking hold of the symbol of authority that gives you the right over the clan to control and determine the future of the clan. A staff which was handed to Isaac while Abraham was still alive. When Abraham could no longer go in or come out, he handed the staff to Isaac. Okay? Now, here's the premise. I've got behind me the two pieces, the taming and the authority. The taming and the authority. Okay? Now look at this pictographic definition, or look at this nomadic definition. A nomad traveled on foot with a staff in his hand to provide support in walking, as well as a weapon to defend against predators or thieves. There is no authority mentioned in that system, and yet watch this. The whole premise behind the word walking is the holding of the staff and moving over the arets with the staff in hand, right? But now watch this. Here is the Hebrew word lach or la'ach, one who walks for another, okay? So now watch this. Then there is a malach, which is what? One who walks for another, who bears a message, a messenger. You guys don't know this, but this is the word for angel, okay? Or angelos, okay? Now watch this. Malakot is messaging. Malakah is what? Business. The principal occupation of one's life, a service. Okay? Now look at this. Halak is the word walk. Now when we see the word walk in Hebrew, what do we know? When it says Noah walked with God, we know that that was actually something other than just strutting down the road with the intensification of all power in the universe. Now, here's the part that a lot of people cannot functionally adjust their brains to, but we're going to get you there. Here is the Strong's Concordance number 4427, which is malak, or to reign. Melech, king, is the male ruler of a city or nation or state. But malak, to rule over a kingdom as a king or queen. So a malakah is actually an agent of the king. Who is the king? Well, let's go back to our original wording. Lamed kaf, using the staff to walk, has nothing to do with authority. But the idea that he walks among the people, that he walks the breadth and length of the land. What did Yahweh tell Abraham to do? Walk the breadth and the length of the land. Why? To demonstrate that you are a melech, you are a king. Take authority of this place, right? And the first thing that happens is he ends up attacking Kedalomer as a result of him taking Lot, who was in covenant with him, and therefore it had to do with preserving the name, which consequently isn't on that screen. But anyways, and so what happens? Now we understand that Yahweh tamed the malakto, tamed his businesses. Isn't that crazy? That word works does not mean works. He didn't cease from his works. He ceased from his businesses. And very specifically, his malakto, which is what? The agents of his business. Right? So now what's interesting is we have this idea that you are supposed to cease from malakah. So what is Yahweh's business? Is it a hamburger franchise? No, it is an Elohim process. It is an existence within the realm of gods. And so the premise is that as an agent who has been tamed, you now have become the agent of the family business. So what is Yahweh's family business? Bestowal. So what's interesting is now we have this concept that the actual Sabbath itself is actually a time in which you return to the tent to secure the name, or to ratify, or to reestablish the covenant. To what tent? His tent. So now what's interesting is what we see is that he tames the heavens and the earth, and he tames the businesses. It says malachto is actually plural, the businesses of him. Okay? And the businesses of him, actually it might even be business. Let me check that real quick. Let's go see if that is plural or not. But I think that's really important here. So getting back to our actual verse, we have this right here. And it says that it is actually going to be singular. Okay. It's just in a construct state. I was thinking that Tav was making it actually plural, but it's not. So it's a business. So he tames his business. What's he taming? He's taming those who would become the leaders of his business. Now, it says in the Hebrew that you would secure, right? That you would secure the name through the returning to the tent, right? So if we go into Leviticus chapter 23, we get the laws of the feast days. Let me go ahead and I'm going to just get rid of this one. And I'm going to move this one over to NASB, I believe. It's probably where we need to be. So the Lord spoke to Moses again, saying, like, this is Yahweh, right? And what's he doing? He's speaking mouth to mouth with Moses. So Moses is actually just speaking the things that are going on here. And it says, speak to the sons of Israel, say to them, the Lord's appointed times, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, are my appointed times are these. For 6 days you may work. Let's go see it. For 6 days you may malakah. 4, 6. Okay. Shin, tav is our word for 6. We're not going to study that out right now. But sheshet yomim is what? Whatever 6 actually means in the Hebrew, work in chaos, you shall do, right? You shall do asa melacha, right? Which is what? Business. But in the day, and in the day Hashvi'i, you will return to the tent to secure the name, which is going to be a Shabbaton. We can maybe midrash that, or you can figure it out on your own. What the Vav and the Nun add to it, and then what? Mikra Kadesh. You will have a holy convocation. All Ma'aka lo. Now, I want you to think about this. For 6 days, you will be an agent of the business. But in the 7th, you will return to the tent and secure the name. Right? Return to the tent and secure the name. And not only that, and remember that 7th is actually the day of oath, which we could get into a whole mess of stuff about that, because then we really don't know whether it's actually the weekday, Saturday, but then also we have this concept that it's more about an oath. Now we accept that there was actually a counting of days in which the manna fell, and on the 7th it didn't. That's important. But we're going to go deeper here into the soul of Torah and understand the mechanism by which the rest is occurring. Remember, Paul said, that which is created will show us the invisible attributes of his eternal power and his divine nature. The divine nature is really simple. It's benevolent. It wants to bestow all of its benevolence upon one who would receive it unconditionally. In other words, it's not because it's going to get it in the first place. That's not why he wants to be chosen. He wants to be chosen because of what? Because of the choosing itself. So seeking the giver, not the gift, so to speak, right? Then we have the concept that part of that bestowal is basically a granting of authority, as it were, over everything. Now, that's a little bit off because that would indicate that you are actually separate from the thing when you're not. You're actually a part of it. So in principle, the way it works is you actually become the condition by which creation itself is actually able to exist as a result of your thought, intention, and observation. Now, that's another story, that's another teaching, but the premise is that then becomes the manifestation of the glory of the sons of God, Romans chapter 8. So in that context, then, there is a concept that ma'aka is actually being an agent, in fact, of the business. So let's look at this real quick. Is God in a state of incapacitation in which he has to give to the firstborn the staff? No, there's no incapacity. There's no not being able to go in and come out. However, as a form of benevolence, it's absolutely necessary that his bride be allowed to have full authority in order to choose to receive his benevolence from him through bestowal. Now, when I say bestowal, what I mean is that he's granting it unequivocally, and he's granting it unconditionally. And what that means is that it's not something you can earn, not something you can merit in such a way that you could actually sabotage it by misbehaving, because God knows we have this We have these issues where we like to sabotage stuff because we don't think we deserve it. Which consequently goes back to her original complex in the first place. She can never be him. She doesn't want to receive from him without giving something in return. She can't give anything in return because he's that big. And so she kind of throws a fit. But that's a whole nother story as well. Now, what's interesting is that fit throwing is actually what activates her sovereignty in the first place. So it's actually weird, but in a weird sort of way, it's necessary. But once that rebellion has occurred, she then actually allows him to do what he wanted to do in the first place, which is shikav with her, lay with her. And then while he's out doing his stuff, taming the universe, he sees and teshuvahs because of the oath in the working chaos, or the seventh day. Now, in that whole function, we now have this interesting thing. Lo. Lo means no. It is a negation particle. Let me give you an example. We will actually go into the Ten Commandments, especially because, I mean, Christians don't understand anything but the Ten Commandments. And so in where I want to go is down here to you shall nots. So here's you shall not murder. Okay? You will murder. Look at this. Imperfect. The imperfect designates an action which continuous, incomplete, and open-ended. It has not occurred yet. It will occur. It's a promise. So you shall murder. Not. Sorry, that's not what I wanted to do there. You shall murder not. That's literally what's going on here. That negation particle is erasing that imperative commandment. So it says, you shall murder as a command, as a second person instruction from an authority, and then negate it. So the word lo is actually not. Okay? See, there's that word lo, L-O, right there. Okay? So now going back to our verse from before, when it says no work may be done, that's not what it's saying here. It's saying you are not to operate as a malakha on that day. Not. Right there. There's your negation particle. Not. Right? But instead, you are to what? Sabbath. That is not a noun there. Okay? I know it says noun, but that's an English issue. There's not a noun there. It is actually it is a grammatical conjugation of a verb. And that original verb is to cease and desist, rest. No. We now know where we get that idea of ceasing and desisting, because the sun has set, the day is ended, and now as the horizon is cast this huge, beautiful sunset, the tent is silhouetted and the fire has begun, and now there's something to look towards, to move towards. In fact, the word hallelujah actually means to look at the shiny thing and move towards it. It's all nomadic. It's all ancient Hebrew. It is not American Protestant Christian lifestyle. It is not. It is an ancient path and an ancient way of thinking. And the Sabbath itself is cyclical, which means what? It's Hertzian, which means what? A tone is playing. A very, very slow, weekly cycle of oscillation is creating a vibration, which brings me to my final part of this message. It is subtle, but there is a voice of the Sabbath speaking, instructing, protecting, providing, yes, of course, but really it's actually him being out doing intensification of all power in the universe things, returning to the tent where his bride is dwelling, who he's already lain with, or she wouldn't be a bride, right? She wouldn't be a bride unless he had lain with her, and his memory of that drives him home, returns him to the tent. And if you want to know the science behind this, you want your hubby to return, then you need to shikav with your hubby, because there's chemical stuff going on when he's out over here. But it's really an illustration of the intensification of all power in the universe. And here's the interesting thing about it. Everything that pertains to life, existence, is cyclical and is an illustration of what's actually happening with him. So, do you stop doing work? Yes, absolutely do. I'm going to show you something very, very powerful. The last part of this, the finishing touch, is going to be the most powerful element, and it's simply this. For 6 days, you are supposed to malakah. You are supposed to do all of the things that are given as instruction in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, and subject it, right? You are supposed to be doing all those things, and that's another teaching altogether. But what you're not supposed to do is continue that onto that next day when the manna did not fall. Now, here's the part that's interesting about it. You spend, I've talked about this before, like you're driving in a car and you end up at work and you don't remember going to work and you are on absolute autopilot. You get in an accident and you don't even remember doing the thing that caused the accident. And now you got to explain to the cops, well, yeah, I was at the intersection and this guy just drove right in front of me, right? Because you have no idea what you actually did. And so now all of a sudden you end up at work and you have no idea how it got there because you disassociated. Remember my teaching about meditation. You were meditating on the wrong thing? Yes, absolutely. Because true meditation requires intention. But here's the part that's crazy about it. That disassociation, that ability to completely check out from reality during that time when you're driving down the road, which is really requires some intention and attention, is not happening, and your subconscious gets you to work. You during that moment are completely devoid of understanding about anything that is a responsibility in your life. Proof is in the fact you're driving in the first place, right? But here's the concept. Your ability to disassociate like that and meditate like that and do those things is actually tied into the malakah. I'll explain. So, as a business owner, as an owner, not an agent of a business, I can tell you that the stress, the overwhelming experience, and the other elements of business can make it extremely difficult to not think about or worry about on Shabbat. But I understand that just as much as there's this deep soul of Torah understanding of this commandment, the concept of not doing those things on Shabbat is the lower self element. Your ego has to be told to let go of it for a day. What's interesting is if you intentionally do that, I will explain to you. There is so much going on right now with our businesses in terms of growth and expansion and scaling and rebranding and all kinds of other stuff. I will be right up until the sundown on Shabbat with my thoughts concerning it. But when that sun sets, I'm going to tell you how powerful the mechanism that is present in the person who drives to work and doesn't remember driving to work within the human being, and that is they don't exist for me. I am completely disassociated. I could care less what happens to them during the Shabbat. People will call, leave messages, and on Sunday I'm like, sorry, I had my day and I'm not going to apologize for that. People will get frustrated because something's not fulfilled, etc., etc. And it says, woe to those who wait for the Sabbath to end in order to conduct business again. Let me share with you the context here. Okay? When I say everything ceases to exist, bills, stress, drama, legal stuff, all of that stuff stops on Shabbat. And that's my lower self. Because what really needs to stop on Shabbat is my ability to control my reality for the 6 days. On that 7th day, I am not even allowed to do that. But instead, I am supposed to, as the bride, as a corporate collective conscience with others, be in complete connection with the fact that the only reason he came back to the tent is because of the Shechav. The only reason why he returned is because of the intimacy we experienced. But what that requires is for me to allow him to be 100% in a state of bestowal with me and realize I can't give anything back to him. I can't give him any pleasure except that he wants to give me pleasure. And if I receive that, that gives him pleasure. But that's actually just a satisfaction of a desire. Meaning, in its simplicity, there's only one thing that's supposed to be occurring on Shabbat. And that is the intimate connection on the higher self level of a release of reality. Really crazy how this would really actually play out if we did it perfectly, which we're always striving to be perfect, but we're never arriving at it because of all the nuances of perfection. There wouldn't be a reality if we truly ceased completely. Everything material around us would cease to exist. We would be in a realm or a place other than reality if we truly honored Shabbat the way that we wanted to. But what's crazy about it is what's actually occurring on Shabbat is loud and boisterous and chaotic, and is not a resting in the sense of settling, but a resting in the sense of a recreation. And so here's the crazy part about it. Where you think that you are actually going to sleep and you are enjoying your rest, your body is completely recreating you, balancing, coming into alignment with natural order processes. Well, so is the Shabbat, and so is your soul in the Shabbat. It is an absolute rebuilding of self that has nothing to do with going night-night and has nothing to do with you disassociating from your business. But you have to start on the Malkut level. You have to start at the kingdom level of ceasing, of resting, of disassociating and meditating on the right things. You want to know a really good day for you to dream about the future that has nothing to do with you making an effort? On the Shabbat. You think about what you really actually want. meditate upon it. Because truth be told, you're not going to be the one to bring it to you anyways. You have to go through you have to go through the process of demonstrating that desire by actually doing, because remember, Hebrew is an action language. We don't say I love you, we do I love you, right? We don't claim something, we action it. And so in that way, as you're moving through reality, the truth is that during all of that mechanism of ego and process and all the other things that are contained within having the human experience, because I'll just remind you, you get about 75 years here, more if you're lucky, and then you're done. And after you're done, then you go somewhere else and do a different thing. But rest assured, this was just a pit stop when you had some work to do. You had an action to do. You verbed something during this little tiny minuscule piece of time. Now, 75 years feels like a pretty long time, doesn't it? Yes, but the premise is within that 75 years is an actual cycle of your life. And part of your life will be that time where you will cease to have that responsibility anymore and you'll move on to the next thing. And everybody who's here left without you will mourn you being gone, but you will have moved on to the next thing. Now, that next thing may be your hell. That next thing may be a loop or a repeat of this life because you don't like how it went. But truth be told, is when you elevate and when you move out of it, when you gain your shalom and you feel like it's accomplished, you will move on to the next thing. But that doesn't have anything to do with the moment. And in the moment is where we have the biggest problem. The moment of Shabbat is absolutely about a complete disassociation from that which would be Malakah, from that which would be your rulerships, your stewardships, your authorities. Now, I have, as a result of the commandment to Mikra, a service on Shabbat. I do that out of a consideration for those who would like to hear Torah and hear wisdom on Shabbat. But truth be told, is that if it was in a more perfect sense, it would be recorded on a different day, listened to on a different day, and this day would have no devices turned on. But for now, we will continue as even our Messiah did when he went into the synagogue and opened the scroll and read from the scroll. Why? Because somebody still needs to hear it. And we are kind of creatures of habit. We have very specific programming from when we were Christians that we are supposed to do something on the holy day, right? So my point behind all of this is what you thought you understood about the Sabbath, that it was a settling, that it was a quietness. You need to know it's probably one of the most craziest days of energy and of chaos than any other day of the week. Partially because where you are in control of your reality for those 6 days, on the seventh, you are not. Now, on the lower Malkut level, you still are. But as you continue to learn how to surrender that up, there will come a time where your ascendancy will supersede that of ceasing from that which is in the heavens and the earth. So the premise behind the Shabbat, or behind rest, the reality of rest, is chaos. Let me repeat that. The reality of rest is chaos. The reality of rest is absolute unconformity to your expectations, a lack of order, an absolute tumultuous storm. But now let me demonstrate something really quick. You see, when we hear the word storm, or we think about a storm, We actually see thunder and lightning and rain and wind as a storm. We think to ourselves, man, that's crazy. That's chaotic. There's no order there. But truth be told is there's actually two governing bodies to a storm, a high pressure system and a low pressure system that contain it, put boundaries around it, put a Torah around it. And it's in absolute control in the moment that it's doing what it's doing. When it's all spread out and it's all dissipated and out here doing its own thing, you could not tell. But when it's brought together into a commandment of information in which it has to conform to those boundaries and to those forces, it is actually in a state of rest. Because the truth be told is that our perception of rest is very different from nature's perception of rest. We are actually a very lazy, path of least resistance entities. We do not like speed bumps. We do not like stop signs. We do not like resistance or friction. And we expect that the Shabbat is actually going to provide that because we have such a misunderstanding, because we've gotten so used to doing the whole go sit on a pew on Sunday. When you're done, go to the local steakhouse, come home, watch football, and end your day, lit off of beer and popcorn. Truth be told is that this day, the Shabbat, is actually the day of the oath, an oath that was taken as and ratified through the consummation intercourse between the bride and the groom. And the day of the oath is actually absolutely the work in chaos of the oath, and has nothing to do with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Because if we try to count it that way, we have a problem, don't we? Because it's not until the fourth day that there's actually a sun. And so when we start to get into young earth, or we start to get into old earth, or evolution, or any of those other arguments that are completely irrelevant to the book of Genesis, because of what it really is actually saying in the Hebrew, we miss the absolute truth. Yahweh is going to steer himself towards the tent. And while he's in the tent, you will have provision, protection, and instruction. And what's crazy is instruction is knowledge, and knowledge is intercourse. Adam knew his wife, and she conceived. Knowledge is just rhetoric, which is the what and the why repeated by the who and the how. And so what's interesting is all that is the coming together of the masculine and feminine, or the testosterone-infused body, the estrogen-infused body, who have the same hormone that ends up ratifying the oath, sealing it into a bond that is inseparable beyond emotional attachment. But you get my point. It's inseparable. In fact, people, I don't know this about women, but I can tell you, people who I have been intimate with from years back, I am still very much aware of them. And what I mean by that is that I still care. Because, again, that's how humans operate. It is a memory context process. And that memory context process actually creates and ratifies an oath or covenant. And that memory context process makes it to where he can be way out in the universe doing something and still on Shabbat return to his bride. So where we call, in Judaism, we call Lecha Dodi, Lecha Skala, when we say, walk towards the bride, which is the Sabbath, my beloved. The truth is that the Sabbath itself is actually the inaugural work in chaos of the consummation of the bonding to begin with. The actual actioning of the oath, in which that which is in authority creates a promise that they then subject themselves to in such a way that they come under the authority of that promise. That's the Hebrew understanding of promise. So now Shabbat starts to become about promise and marriage and all that. But what we will talk about in Midrash is that Shabbat is also a war, and Shabbat is something else as well. But for those of you who are going to take the time to seek the wisdom and the understanding of Shabbat, need to completely grasp that it is not a settling, it is a stirring, it is a storm. And because we perceive storms to be out of control and disordered because of what they appear to be doing, truth is that they are totally governed, as is Shabbat, by the